Hello, my friends, and welcome to another episode of the Intentional Wisdom Podcast. I'm your host, Greg Campion, and I am delighted to bring you this conversation today with Oliver Burkeman. If you don't know Oliver, he is a well-known journalist turned author, probably most known for his best-selling book, 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals, which is a commentary on how we should think about spending the 4,000 weeks that most of us on average have on this earth. That is definitely worth checking out if you haven't read that one. More recently, in the subject of this conversation is Oliver is out with a new book called Meditations for Mortals. Now, don't be scared off by the word meditation in the title. This is less a book about sitting with one's eyes closed and more of a book about not forgetting to live and enjoy your life today. I will say I did have a minor existential crisis in reading this book because consciously or subconsciously, I tend to live a fairly quantified existence these days. I've got fitness trackers tracking and monitoring all of my health stats. I've got my week completely scheduled out every Sunday down to the minute. And I've got streaks going, like no alcohol for 2 years and 8,000 steps a day. All that kind of stuff. As you listen to this or read my newsletter, you probably know I'm super into. But in trying to perfectly adhere to all of these high standards that I've set for myself, the question I'm kind of pondering now is, am I forgetting to live and enjoy my actual life? That's kind of a big question, and reading Oliver's book and having this conversation with him have definitely got me thinking about that one. So excited to get into it and dive right in. But before we do, just a quick reminder to head over to gregcampion.substack.com to subscribe to my newsletter, Intentional Wisdom. It's one email every other week. It's got the best of what I'm learning from folks just like Oliver and everything I'm reading or listening to on topics ranging from health and fitness to nutrition to productivity to parenting, all that stuff. And if you missed one of these podcasts, don't worry. I always recap them in the newsletter. So you can check that out, gregcampion.substack.com. I'll link it in the show notes as well. Head over and check that out. All right, enough intro. Here's Oliver Burkeman. All right, Oliver Burkeman, welcome to Intentional Wisdom.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
I'm excited. I have been deep into the throes of your content over the last month plus. And so today we're here to talk about your latest book, which is Meditations for Mortals. And I have to say, like, just going back, I've been following your work for some time. So I read your book, 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals. I'm noticing a theme there. Your work is definitely not for anyone who is immortal. So I like how you're niching down.
Yep.
So anyways, I loved that book. I loved how it was completely not what I expected it to be, and that it ended up being more of a philosophy book, in my opinion, than a necessarily an actual like sort of productivity time management book. But anyhow, I came across a couple of months ago, I came across on Amazon, as I tend to sort of keep an eye out for books that are coming, especially from authors that I really like. And I saw that you were coming out with a new book around this time, and I reached out to you and I said, I'd love to have you on the podcast. And oh, by the way, I see there's an interesting format to this book in that it's sort of a something you follow along with for 28 days. So I asked you if I could be sort of a guinea pig of sorts and sort of try it out, and then we can talk about how it all went. So here we are. I did it. We're here to talk about it, and it's exciting. So maybe you could just start telling me a little bit about maybe the background on where you got the idea from this book and why you decided to write it, and then we can talk about my experience and all that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the essence of where this book came from is that it really was becoming very clear to me and through earlier books and just life in general, that it's extremely possible to have a very clear sense of what you want your life to be and how you want to be showing up for life and the project you want to embark upon and all the rest of it, and just not to actually do it at all, or at least not anywhere near as much as you would like. And so I sort of became a bit fixated on this question of actually doing things and what was going on there. And so this book, I guess if it has a single topic or theme, it is about sort of actually getting around to the things that we already know or intuit we want to be spending our lives doing, which, means for a finite human beings, at some point we're going to have to do it now rather than putting it off till later. And this extraordinary tendency that people have, absolutely me included, of approaching life as if what we're doing right now is trying to get in control of everything, trying to get on top of everything, trying to figure out once and for all how to do our work or be a good parent or be a good partner or anything else. Constantly or fix our procrastination problems. There's something between where we are and where we want to be that we have to sort of get over, with the result that we just sort of endlessly postpone the quote real meaning of life off into the future. And so, as you say, the book is sort of 28 perspective shifts or proposed techniques and tools for crossing this gap from knowing to doing. And I really, really realized that I wanted the book to embody this idea as in its structure, and not to it would be very hypocritical to write a book about actually doing things and then write a book that was kind of some big complicated system where you read it, took you days and days and days to read it, and you took detailed notes, and then you decided one day in the future you're going to put this system into practice, right? That's exactly what I wanted to avoid. So the hope in this 4-week structure, not that I can control how people read my book or I'm making any effort to do so, but if you decide, as I was very glad that you did, to experiment with it in this way, is that these very modest perspective shifts might make a real but small difference to how you lived through the 24 hours in which you read each one. That something in the sort of patience required to not race ahead through the book might actually be beneficial in itself. And that you might, as a result of all this, get more of a taste of the approach that I'm calling imperfectionism, and that we can discuss in much more detail if you like. Now, towards the end of the book, I also point out that, obviously, it would also be completely hypocritical if actually there was some 4-week way of installing this outlook once and for all, and then life is perfect from now on. So it's not really a sort of 4 weeks to conquer all the challenges of life. That would be absurd. But I hope that on that time scale, it's enough to sort of feel that, it's long enough that maybe this has sort of got under your skin a little bit, or connected with your own thoughts and experiences a little bit. And at the same time, it's short enough that, when you begin a 4-week process of anything, it's only 4 weeks, right? The end is in sight. So I hope that it's sort of modest and manageable, and as a result, effective in that way at sort of playing a role in moving people towards actually doing the things that they want to be doing. That's my aspiration. Right. If you tell me now that it's a complete failure and that none of this has worked for you in the slightest, then I shall be slightly crestfallen.
Well, that would probably be more on me, I think. But okay, so let me tell you a little bit about my experience. So first of all, I do like this idea of these small digestible chapters. You read one a day. So I'm going to hold up the book. This is the American version. Very catchy.
Yeah, the hardbacks just arrived here, and I think I don't know if it's possible to tell on the camera, but they're even oranger than the
yes, I was wondering. I saw the UK version is completely different, and I was wondering if it's just Americans are attracted to bright colors. Oh,
UK
yeah, there you go.
Is this one?
There must be some kind of psychological logic behind it all.
I'm sure.
Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about my experience with it. So, this book has traveled with me more than any book I can recall in recent memory. And the funny thing is, I haven't really gone anywhere over the last month. I've really just kind of been going to work and stuff like that. But it's so what I did a really bad job of was coming up with the same time of day to read each chapter, right? And so I kind of wish maybe I would have done something like that, like committed to reading it first thing every morning. What I did was it was a little bit more ad hoc, and for I want to say the first 10 days, I absolutely nailed it, and I did not miss a day. And then after that, I slipped a little bit, and like all of a sudden a day would go by and I missed it, and I was like, oh my god, now I have to read 2 tomorrow or what have you. And anyways, long story short, I was not perfect in my adherence. I think you used the word daily-ish in this
Yeah.
book.
Yeah.
Yes. And
It's
I
much
think I,
better to have not been perfect than
yeah,
to,
I think
yeah, right.
that's,
Yeah.
I wasn't beating myself up too much because of the whole philosophy of your book and your work anyways, is sort of that imperfectionism is kind of probably more than okay. And so anyways, long story short, got through the book, loved it, had to cram probably the last 5 chapters in the last day because I got behind on it. But there were so many things in here that just started to infiltrate my daily life, and we'll talk about some of those. And when you see an idea and idea is communicated to you, then it's one of those things where you start to see it everywhere, right? And so that happened to me a few times through this book. This book reminded me of another book. Would you have any guess what it would remind me of?
No. Also, I'm on dangerous territory here, aren't I? Because if I say something too sort of
I'll give
too
you a hint.
impressive,
It's the most
looks,
famous book of all time.
yeah, yeah. Is it a little bit like the Bible?
Yeah.
No. Go. What are you thinking of?
No, that is actually what I was thinking, and it's funny. I'm
All right then.
I'm not a particularly religious person, but I know that for folks who are, this kind of like daily reading of the Bible kind of
Right.
sets them in the, kind of helps reset the moral compass, so to speak. And so I
will
don't
say, I'm not gonna allow parallels between the authors of the books, but the devotional, that idea, the idea of a devotional or of a quote, because I haven't even mentioned, and I don't think we have yet, that there's a quotation from somebody else begins each day. And I did go back over a number of biblical devotionals, like when I was preparing this book.
Yeah.
Obviously, in those cases, it's always a quote from the Bible, but it's a really interesting rhythm for encountering this kind of ideas, I think.
That's the comparison. Yeah, it's sort of the rhythm and the sort of just daily reminders, sort of thing. So that's what that parallel did come to mind for me. And then I went down a rabbit hole and started thinking, oh my gosh, that's like $1 billion idea to do like the secular Bible or something like that, right? Because it's like there seems to probably be a massive need for that. Let me ask you this real quick before we dive into some of the ideas. Meditations for Mortals. Did you consider any other titles for the book?
The subtitle got a lot of back and forth and thinking, but the title was pretty consistent. I will say that in the very earliest days of this book, and this idea did not survive very long, there was a thought that this might be a sort of a page a day structure of book, right? It might be a quotation with a small commentary every single day for a year. There are problems with these kinds of books. I think there's something a little bit unrelenting about them, even encountering them as a reader. And then also, depending on where you want to draw your quotations from, there is a sort of epic permissions related challenge in that.
Oh, right.
But actually, I'm really glad that eventually it suddenly seemed, and then it was like, should it be 1 chapter per week and there should be 52? And it felt so right when I finally figured out, no, it's 4 weeks, but it's 7 chapters for each week. So it's substantial enough. It's not a super long book, but it's not nothing. And I think that kind of balance is really important. Something to get your teeth into, but it's not like, oh wow, this is like a year's project. Because I'm just going to put that off.
That feels right to me as someone, and we can talk about this. This is sort of probably contrary to some of what you talk about in this book, but I've used streaks quite a bit as like a motivational challenges, and that 30-day is like a real sweet spot. Like it's long enough to achieve something substantial and short enough that you can get your arms around it. So to
Yeah.
me, that feels like the approximately the right amount of time. Yeah. So anyhow, I will say there were definitely periods, and well, two other things I'll mention. One is in terms of how I use this book. I decided to that this book was sort of a canvas for me, and I've been moving in this direction in terms of how I've been reading books lately, anyways. And so as you
So, I mean, you've written all over it. Amazing.
it's written all over. It's highlighted. It is. I'm writing like what I'm feeling while I'm reading it. I'm like this paragraph, challenges my entire identity, like that sort of thing. And so I used to read books and be like, oh God, this is, it's pristine. I can't touch it. What if I need to loan it to a friend or something like that? And now I'm like, okay, I see it as like a working document. And the reality is the only people who are probably ever going to see it are my kids, like probably after I pass away, and they're going to look through things and be like, wow, Dad was really doing some weird stuff down in the basement.
Yeah, no, I'm a big, I think that's obviously, there's two different approaches to taking notes and things, right? And one of them I do sort of rail against a little bit in the book is if you're taking notes in an effort to try to retain everything and try to sort of squirrel it all away into your brain, I think there's something to be resisted in that. But if it's a form of engagement with what you're reading, then absolutely kind of making a mess and scribbling and drawing pictures and highlighting is all in. I think it's completely in keeping with this idea that I'm really glad to hear it, because sort of that I hope this book can have, if it works, as it were, which is, yeah, to sort of become a tiny little part of one's reality, rather than, yeah, being something that you read, keep pristine, and sort of put aside as something
Yes.
that exists separately.
I totally
Yeah.
agree. I totally
Also
agree.
means that,
Yep.
if you do want to lend it to somebody else, you've got no option but to actually buy them a copy instead. So,
That's true. Okay.
sorry about that.
There you go. There you go. Okay, cool. So there were a few points when I was reading this book where I encountered what I would describe as a minor existential crisis, because you were challenging. I think maybe some of this is more subconscious than actually conscious, but a lot of the behaviors that you describe, I see in myself. Whether it's being sort of a self-punishing perfectionist, as you say somewhere in here, or just almost living like a bit of a quantified existence. And we can talk about some examples. Like like I mentioned, I'm big into streaks, so I have like this 2-year non-alcohol streak going. I've got this 8,000 steps a day streak going. Like these things are quite opposite of daily-ish. So anyways, I want to talk about some of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So we'll get there, but maybe let's dive into one of the ideas that I think, as I was starting this book, one of the ideas that really resonated early on with me, and I told my wife about it, and then a couple of days later, she sort of repeated it back to me in a different setting or context. And this is the idea that we're all riding in a kayak instead of a super yacht. Tell me what you mean by that.
This is just one of the sort of metaphors that, for me, gets closest I can come to expressing the sort of overall feeling that I'm trying to draw attention to. So the metaphor is just that, to be human is to be as if you're in a little one-person kayak, right? You've been sort of thrown onto the river of time. The water is passing away beneath you, whether you like it or not. It's a very vulnerable situation. All you can sort of do is steer as best you can. You don't know exactly what's coming next or where it's leading, but you're sort of, doing your best to steer things in the best direction. And, in a certain sense, it's solitary. There's lots and lots of other people in their little kayaks too, but you do sort of have to navigate on your own in a certain way. And that, to me, sums up the whole sort of vulnerability of being finite, and this idea of a river of time, and it's something that occurs in lots of different other writers. But that, for me, really, really brought it into focus. And the contrast there is with how I slightly imaginatively assume it to be if you are the captain of one of those enormous, like, I don't know, 140-foot super yachts where there's multiple decks and you're up in the bridge and you sort of program the destination into the ship's computers, and then you sit back and it's absolutely silent up there, and the super yacht just goes on towards its destination. There's an incredible sense of control and knowing, or being almost certain, what is going to be coming down the pike. So the contrast here is that I think that we do a lot of things to try to make ourselves feel like we're on the bridge of the super yacht. And actually, and a lot of productivity, self-help advice is actually like that same kind of enabling that fantasy. And when actually we're all always in the kayak anyway. And I think a lot of what I'm trying to do here for the reader, but also, of course, for myself, because that is how these books of advice always work, is just draw attention to the sort of many absolutely unavoidable ways in which we are in the kayak, in which we don't know what the future holds, in which we cannot act with perfect information or with achieve total control over what's happening, let alone what will happen in the future, all the rest of it. And how beneficial, like liberating, but also sort of actively empowering and productivity enhancing even, it is to be more sort of honest with oneself about the fact that that's the situation that we're in.
Mm. So it's this sort of fallacy of control. And then ultimately, I think your argument is that once you accept that you're absolutely not in control, things get a bit easier. And well, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. And I was just going to say, and you sort of
yeah,
find the sense in which you do have agency or an ability to act on the world or some kind of influence over it, right? So it's almost like in giving up that quest for a certain kind of control, you get the thing that you sort of were wanting, which is right. So it's not a sort of argument for just sitting back and letting the world happen to you. It's an argument for how actually that kind of control is counterproductive in the end. It doesn't. It has the opposite effect.
So my example while I was reading this book was, and I think I just read that chapter a few days earlier, and then my wife and I had a weekend getaway planned. We were going away for our anniversary. We have not been away from our kids for one single night this year. So this was like literally one night going up to the mountains. We had a nice dinner planned, hiking, the whole nine. And then about a day before that, like our childcare fell through. All the kids got sick and everything just fell through. And it was like, okay, actually we're not going like that. That one night away this year, no, that's not going to happen. And so I just remember talking to my wife and being like, well, you know what? This is like we're in a kayak. Like we do not have control over the situation here, and it kind of is what it is. So let's just roll with it. And like we'll make dinner at home. We'll sit outside on the deck. We'll chill, and that's just our reality. And so that was my little example of just realizing how little control I actually had of my reality.
And the great example there is, right, that the great thing about what the story you told is that you did have some power to make that unplanned version of things be something thoughtful and enjoyable and special. And you got a funny story out of it. Whereas if you'd been sort of clinging to that control, you would have just sort of railed angrily against the situation, still not gone away because you're not going to abandon your kids with no childcare, and would have had just a miserable time. So actually, it's like by sort of surrendering to the situation, you do find the ways in which you can live intentionally. Yeah,
I think that's right. All right, let's talk a little bit about perfectionist fantasy. So in the day 14, I really liked your quote. I think you said it's a Haitian proverb: beyond mountains, more mountains, right? So obviously, you have difficulties ahead of you, but guess what? There's just more behind that sort of thing. And then I'm kind of like maybe conflating some of your different ideas here, but I would say, to me, this concept that whatever's happening right now is fundamentally flawed is probably one of the most powerful concepts in the book that resonated with me, and that I did a bit of soul searching or just thinking about, how am I actually doing this in my day-to-day life? And I think it's probably a lot. I think there's a good portion of me that is often viewing what's going on right now as some precursor to where, ultimately I get to where things are, much easier, et cetera. So like the easy example to think of is like, I guess, with money is one thing to think about. So you're like, okay, like money is a consideration, we're spending X amount of money to put our kids through school and this and that. And it's like, okay, there's some like time in the future, retirement or whatever that is, where like the college is paid for and this, and we're in this very like comfortable financial position. And the danger, to maybe give you my interpretation of what you said in this book, is the danger of that is that you're kind of living in that future and you're discounting the present and forgetting that like this is actually, as I think you say somewhere in here, this is not the dress rehearsal, like this is life. Like don't skip it because you're looking off into the future where something is theoretically easier. So talk to me a little bit about that concept. And I know I think that's kind of shows up in a few different places in this book.
I think there's two different things, two different sort of focuses that what you just said make me think of. And one is just that sense, right, of instrumentally living for the future moment of truth and learning to sort of, and honestly, such a struggle for me this has been, but learning to separate the, absolutely real role for judicious retirement planning or something, right? And for not spending every dime you have in the present because the future matters too. Separating that off from the idea that like your life is going to achieve its sort of rubber stamp of having been lived well when you get to your like final years, and you can and you can say, we handled this well, and we got to the we handled our finances properly through a life. That's the real difference for me, right? It's that idea that no, this is life now too, and it's this hour, this day is just as valuable as an hour or day later on. And there's a real issue, with people who have a certain amount of money being sort of too cautious with it, and not getting the most out of it, whether for themselves or for philanthropic contributions or anything else, because the sort of urge to store it up against a kind of existential threat to security or something is so great. And obviously, money is just a very obvious example of something that applies across the board. I think it can get even much subtler when you find that you're living not for sort of some future time that's coming in 30 years' time, or 20 or 40 or 50 years' time, but almost just for like 2 hours in the future. I find that it's quite easy to fall into this mindset where obviously things are not okay now, but I'm expecting that by about 6 p.m. tonight, they will be okay by this definition, right? Because I'll have got something out of the way. And that's okay, because, we all have deadlines to meet and goals to achieve. But it's pretty strange, actually, when you really turn your attention to it, to be constantly just setting just ahead of you the moment when you're going to be like fully or more fully authentically present. And then the related part of this, speaking to what you're talking about there, and that Haitian proverb that you mentioned, is how often it is possible to fall into this mindset of thinking that, right, a time with no problems ought to be coming at some point in the future, that that the problems that I've been navigating today in my work are not only annoying or problematic because there's a specific challenge involved in each one, but they shouldn't even be there at all. Like if my work life was running properly, if life was being fair to me, like I would get up in the morning, there wouldn't be problems. There would just be smooth sailing. And that of course is like just a fantasy, firstly, because there's just no reason to believe that problems per se are ever going to go away. But secondly, I really do think that one wouldn't want them to. Obviously, there are certain kinds of acute and awful problems that one wouldn't wish on anybody, and some that you hope you can get through a whole life never having to encounter. It's not about saying all problems are great, but actually a life literally with no problems, what that was completely smooth sailing, is the same as a life of total control, right? It's this thing that we think we want and that would be a kind of death to experience because there will be nothing to address yourself to. So the thing I'm always reminding myself of is, and it's in the book, it's a friend of mine who made this observation for herself, right? You sort of, especially in the work context, you think like, oh, I could really do my work well if there weren't all these problems. And then you're like, no. The reason you're employable, the reason you
Yes.
have a job is because you are pretty good at dealing with the problems.
Right.
And I don't
That's the
question
job.
that. Right, exactly. I don't question that when the problem is the problem of how to structure a chapter. Like, obviously, until artificial intelligence completely destroys all publishing, that is, I can see that is a definition of me being okay at what I do, that I can grapple with the problem of how to structure a chapter. But it's very easy when it comes to like life admin or business finances or whatever it is to be like, not only is this difficult that I'm trying to solve, but like it shouldn't, nothing like this should be in my life. And it's a very sort of unproductive and resentful way to go through your days.
I like the quote. There's a quote in your book. I like, you say, but to face no problems at all would leave you with nothing worth doing. So you might even say that coming up against your limitations and figuring out how to respond is precisely what makes a life meaningful and satisfying. So kind of to your point, right? Like the point is sort of the problems that we encounter.
Right. Or to say the same thing in different words, if you define the concept of a problem broadly enough, then there's nothing that we do in life that we enjoy that doesn't fit the bill. Maybe, I don't know, maybe there are extreme examples that would test that claim, but certainly, figuring out how to renovate a house, figuring out how to grow your relationship with your partner, figuring out the mystery in the detective novel that you're reading, right? Like these are problems. And something about the fact that they're problems is what makes them compelling.
Okay, let's talk about day 12, where you talk about doing things daily-ish, which I mentioned earlier. I want to discuss that concept because I mentioned this one has kind of butted up against my identity a little bit. And so let's talk through this. So as I mentioned, I've got a few streaks going. I've used streaks over time. The one that's been the hardest, the one that I've committed to the longest is the no alcohol. But I'm wavering. So I'm 2 years into it, and I'm actually having a lot of questions right now if this rule is serving me or not. So I think that's worth talking about. And so tell me, like, just generally about your thoughts there on doing stuff dailyish versus being, let's say, very regimented, which is probably the approach that I've taken in different parts of my life.
Well, firstly, I want to frame this by saying that I stand up for the idea that whatever that phrase is, the opposite of a great truth is also a great truth, right? I think there is a case here for the idea of dailyish, which is this notion of, get it from Sam Harris, that comes from Sam Harris, the meditation teacher, podcaster. This notion that what really matters in discipline and habit building is not the sort of obsessive fixation with every single day, but it's the energy to keep coming back and back and back, even if sometimes it is separated by a day or two or three where you fell off the wagon, and that on some level getting back on is the muscle that's being trained, right? In some ways, meditation is always the example I think is very useful here, right? You follow your breath, you get distracted, you bring your focus back to your breath. If you didn't get distracted ever, you wouldn't be deepening your
that's fair. Yep.
meditation skills. So actually failing, as we would call it on some level, is correct, is the right way to go. And I'm making the case, we can talk about Jerry Seinfeld and the Seinfeld technique there if you want, and my discovery that even Jerry Seinfeld doesn't really follow the Seinfeld technique. But that sort of regimented dailiness, I think very often, especially with creative work and those kind of sort of lifestyle habits, gets in the way, because it becomes a source of stress. If you miss it once, it makes you very likely to give up the whole thing because you failed. It lends a sort of a clenched quality to life that actually takes some of the enjoyment out of life. I'm pretty sure I want to say on the other end of this, just quickly, that especially for people who have decided to do things like cut out alcohol because of like addiction problems, and you haven't said that to you, and I don't think it is, but or anything like that. There's something really helpful about the absolute clarity of I just don't do that.
Yep.
And I'm always bumping up against wisdom from 12-step philosophies that seem very overlapping with the stuff I'm writing about here. And so I would never sort of spurn that kind of approach to renunciation, because that very simple kind of like, I don't do that, I think can be incredibly powerful. I don't think it's necessarily that contradictory with the idea that if I'm going to try to bring a new habit into existence, I'm going to try and do it in a gentle and dailyish way. I think they sort of might even go together, but I think both these things are true somehow.
Yeah, and don't worry, I'm fortunate that I've never struggled with addiction.
Right.
So
I'm not about to push you back into a terrible place.
No. But yeah, no, I would say, so for me, it's been more of I think the usefulness of having that no alcohol thing be a streak is that I've found that like when you have a rule in place, in some ways the world kind of conforms to the goal that you're trying to reach. So you don't have, you don't have friends kind of saying, oh, how about, just a drink tonight or whatever. Everybody kind of knows that you're not drinking. So that's, I found that to be helpful. And I've found it to be helpful that, so what I've encountered with drinking is that, almost every occasion can be a drinking occasion. And so like 3-4 times a week, there's often a reason to drink. Mm-hmm. And I found that it can drain your willpower to have to keep making that decision again and again and again.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of been my rationale. Now, the flip side of that coin is, 2 years into it, well, let me put it this way. I don't feel that there is some danger that and let me caveat this with, again, I've been fortunate. I've never struggled with addiction, purely quitting alcohol for, health reasons,
lifestyle,
et cetera.
Yeah.
But I don't feel that there is some danger that if I have a glass or two of wine out to dinner with my wife, that I'm suddenly going to slip into this crazy alcoholic mode or something like that. And I think one of the chapters in your book, you talk about this concept that like we've been raised, or somewhere along the line it got in our heads that we need to watch ourselves like hawks, because if we slip, then it can be all over, sort of thing. So tell me a little bit about that idea.
Yeah, I think that you sort of don't want to feed, I guess, that notion that the sort of self-punishing part of you believes that like a perfect record is required as the minimum acceptable standard. I do think this example of alcohol is kind of an interesting and a tricky one. Not because even for people who don't have any sort of addiction issues around it. It's like, it is true that one of the direct effects of the first glass of wine is to impede your judgment about whether you should have the second glass of wine, right? So
True.
it's kind of an interesting case. But I do think that, you know, I guess my sort of, well, I've sort of repeated myself a bit, but my issue with the whole sort of streak idea is that, you've got to become the kind of person who does this. You sort of see it stretching off into your future. Every single day I've got to do this thing. It can become a sort of a level of sort of caution or hypervigilance over your own life that is antithetical to sort of fully living it. I would say, you know, I don't drink very much, but I do drink every week, at least, you know, once or twice. And when I have stopped for like weeks at a time, I kind of haven't noticed any difference. So I think that if I had noticed a big difference that would become its own draw, then, you know, the desire to actually follow that in the direction of a streak would be a very defensible thing. It wouldn't be a kind of moralized thing where you've decided you've got to not fall off this tightrope. It's more like, I do this because I know I have a better and more enjoyable life that way. The other thing, of course, not that I'm giving you advice on whether you should start drinking again or not, but the part of the thing about this notion of rules that serve life, rules that become things that help you live better rather than things you then have to follow all the time, is that I could imagine, for example, choosing to adapt it. You could say, you know, that you only, maybe sometimes people want to say on specific days or number of times, but maybe even locations, right? You know, maybe it's only in restaurants or something like that, right? You can, that rules can adapt in ways that serve where you are in your life, and then they can continue being very useful tools, as opposed to becoming these sort of oppressive things where, like, there is no inherent benefit. Like, there's no inherent benefit in that streak, right? Nothing is served by the sheer fact of keeping up the streak. So the question becomes, like, is this serving what I want to do or not?
And then I'm kind of like, with that and some of the other streaks I have going, like, I'm like, am I doing this? Is this really for me and my health, or is there some even subconscious thing going on here where I'm doing it to sort of try to get achievement, or, you know, like others, praise from others or something like that, where, so you can go deep in terms of psychoanalyzing yourself on this. But I mean, for me, I think what resonates from your work here is that I think it's just thinking about, like, again, like, is this serving you? Is it really going to be a disaster if you, you know, take a day off from this? Some of those ideas just of, you know, going back to, like, making sure that you're not living life as it is some dress rehearsal. Because even something like this, you could argue, like, okay, I'm doing this because I want to be like a really healthy 85-year-old
Right.
or whatever. And then you're like, well, you know, maybe it's more of a balance. And maybe,
Right.
you know, who knows if I ever get to 85, and wouldn't it be a shame if I missed 46?
Right. And it's not that you shouldn't be thinking about being a healthy 85-year-old. It's a question of understanding that, right, the year when you're 85 and the year when you are your age now both count, you know.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's yeah, and there's a self-trust aspect to it, isn't there, as well? There's that sort of idea, well, if I did this once, I wouldn't be able to trust myself to do it again, and to not do it again. And I think in the case of, like, addictive personalities with addictive substances, that's true, right? But in a lot of the time, we can actually trust ourselves to navigate well through future bits of life as well. We don't need to hold it all in sticking to the street right now.
Yeah. Okay, I want to talk about the idea of people pleasing. I want to sort of talk about two ideas: the people pleasing and the related idea of scruffy hospitality. So, I would like to read a quote from you. And the reason I want to read it is because when I read it, I don't know if you can see that, but
I can see some highlighting and some
I
scribbling, which is
circled
all
it
very
and
good
said
to
the
see.
word "whoa!" exclamation point. So this is a quote from Whitney Cummings that apparently was very impactful on me. So she says, "People pleasing is a form of assholery because you're not pleasing anybody. You're just making them resentful because you're being disingenuous. And you're also not giving them the dignity of their own experience by assuming they can't handle the truth." All right, let's talk about it. People pleasing and maybe some scruffy hospitality.
Sure. I mean, what I loved about that quote and really brought things into focus for me was this sense that, and I've had an experience like this that I can talk about in my own work, where even if you are aware of this idea that you go through life giving a bit too much focus to whether people are cross with you or impatient with you, and that it's sort of not a pleasant way to be, it's a big realization to understand that it doesn't even work on its own terms, that people are not, it's not actually the people we call people pleasers, and I certainly consider myself one of those going back into some extent today, like, it's bad. It's a misnomer because other people are not pleased by dealing with you, and that's what the Whitney Cummings quote is really getting to. I write about this moment, kind of very mundane at the time, when I was early on in my career as a newspaper journalist, and an editor at the paper had asked me if I could take on another assignment, and she was like, it wasn't one of those ones I had to take on because of my job. It was like, do you have the bandwidth for this? And I spent like the whole day not responding because I didn't really have the bandwidth, but also I didn't want to disappoint her. And she said something like, in a far more friendly fashion than I probably had any right to expect. She said, once I did finally say no to her at the end of the day, she said, if you can't do something, it's usually just a lot easier for everyone if you say no right away. And like years later, I suddenly thought like, oh my God, this is one of the most extraordinary things anyone has ever said to me, and so sort of generous and kind, because it was a clue to that fact that actually, yeah, if you're going around with that attitude towards life, trying to exert perfect control over the emotions of everyone around you, you just end up sort of having your emotions get in the way of the smooth functioning of life. It doesn't actually lead people to be happier at all. And so what I'm arguing in that section is that there's a real case for understanding, not that other people's emotions don't matter, not that you should just sort of barrel your way through life without regard for how other people feel, but that other people's emotions are just sort of one more thing to be weighed in the balance. And in the example I gave, the potential disappointment experienced by this editor had to be weighed against the sort of annoyance caused to that editor and the sort of agony caused to me all day. And actually, when you tot up all those things and balance them in a more calm and collected way, it's obvious that one should just, shoulder the burden of causing mild disappointment. Of course, we always massively overestimate how much people care about us anyway, but maybe if you don't answer certain emails in a timely fashion, some people get mad at you. And for some people's situation and certain emails, the consequences of them getting mad at you might be really serious, and you want to make sure that you do that. And for other people in other contexts, you might say, okay, I accept the reality of the likelihood of that reaction, and for now it's something that I'm prepared to shoulder because I'd like to spend the evening watching a movie with my son instead, actually. Thank you very much. And it's not that the emails don't deserve a response, it's just that everything is a balance of, being finite just means that there's a downside to everything you choose. So you're choosing which downside to experience.
I agree.
And then really quickly, sorry.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, I've noticed that in a professional context, and I think part of it is just maturity as well, is that I'm much more comfortable saying no. I think I used to be like an inbox Nazi. Like I was, extraordinarily quick to answer every single email. And I probably did this for years and years.
Yeah.
And you say somewhere in the book, I think that just ends up getting you more emails, right? And but I think I'm more comfortable these days. Certainly not perfect, but more comfortable these days. If I get an ask and it's just not something I can prioritize, just saying no. And I think that is a certain kind of kindness to, to sort of back up the story you just told. I think that's a certain sort of kindness to others to say, hey, no, sorry, I can't do this right now. I'm going to give you that kind of quick no response. So you can go figure out what your next best option is. Right. So.
Right. I think that's right. And I think that, I'm amazed how frequently people do understand that. I can imagine someone listening to this and saying, well, isn't that just because you've reached a position of relative financial or career security, and aren't there lots and lots of people who can't afford to make that choice? And I think the answer to that is firstly, yes, there are, and that then the balance is going to be weighed differently for those people. But secondly, we are really prone to assuming that we can't do that actually other people's needs are not something to be weighed in the balance. They're a sort of, force majeure that just overtakes everything, right? You just can't allow that to happen. The thing I still struggle with is when people send requests by email where I just can't even really figure out what it is that the request is, right? If you ask me to read something and I don't have time, or you ask me to be on a podcast and I don't have the bandwidth for that, I understand now how to say a polite no to that. But people who just want to vaguely discuss something further,
that's almost a little bit of a selfish ask too, and that's taking
confuses
their problem and making it your problem, and you're like,
right. I have been known to just let emails like that.
That's okay.
Slide by.
That's okay. That's okay.
When they reply.
And then the related idea of Scruffy Hospitality, I just wanted to cover that quick because that one resonated with me, and I would say well, tell us what that is. Let's start.
Right. I guess the connection there is that, when you try to go around pleasing everybody, you're sort of putting on a facade between you and your true emotions out of some notion that that's what you've got to do. And as a result, you're just making life a bit worse for everybody. Scruffy Hospitality is this notion sort of coined by a pastor from Tennessee called Jack King, where he and his wife realized that they loved sort of entertaining guests for dinner and putting on this whole thing where they, tidy everything up, make it look perfect, mow the lawn, cook something amazing, which means you have to go and get the shopping and choose the recipe. And it becomes so involved putting on this facade, different kind of facade, because it can be lovely to put on a wonderful glittering facade of a dinner party. That's a skill in itself. But it was so onerous that they were not inviting people, right? So the idea of Scruffy Hospitality is like, hang on, in our case, we actually value just conversation with our friends more than that. So we're just going to invite people around to eat what we've got in the cupboards. The house is going to be the way it is. And we're going to sort of drop that facade, and as a result, be readier to actually connect with more and more people. And I think what's so interesting about this notion, in my own experience of it, is that it's not just like permission to not try so hard about clearing up the house before you have some friends around or something. There's actually something that is more deeply connecting about being in somebody's home where they haven't tried to impress you with how it looks, or they haven't put up a facade in the same way. And I write in the book, when even before I came across Scruffy Hospitality, like if we were due to have friends around and I noticed like crumbs under the fridge or like mail stacked on the toaster for no reason or something, I would be like, oh no, my goodness, got to clear that up before people arrive. But if I saw that at somebody else's house, I would actually feel like privileged in a way. It's almost like, oh, I'm enough of a friend of you that you were willing to let me into this space. And I think there is an important lesson there, and probably one that goes beyond just sort of having people around for dinner.
Yeah, that really resonated with me because I agree. I was like thinking about it and I was like, the bar would have to be the bar's pretty high for me to be at a friend's house and be offended by that it's not clean enough or something like that. Like it would have to be pretty gross for me to be like, what's going on here?
Right.
But yeah, I mean, that resonates with me because I feel like we probably don't entertain friends as much as we should or maybe would even like to, because honestly, at our house, when we have friends over, it is a massively stressful affair for like 3 days beforehand to get everything tidied up and so I don't know. There may be something for us to learn here from this one.
And at the same time, in the spirit of this book, I hope you are not going to go beating yourself up about that.
No,
no. It's not a big problem. It just might be room for something even better in your.
Yes. Okay. The last concept I wanted to ask you about the book, and we can do this one quick, but I just wanted to ask you because I almost want to do it as a public service announcement, given especially here in the U.S. that we are in this crazy political time period heading into this very contentious election, is day 6 you talk about you can't care about everything. And this kind of idea that living inside the news often feels like a duty of being a good citizen. Tell me about your thoughts on that one.
I just think this is the sort of obvious when you stop to think about it point that certainly for anyone who knows anything about the sort of nature of the attention economy in which we now live, where your attention is the scarce resource and news and information are so abundant, it's just inevitably the case that you're going to learn about more anxiety-inducing things, more human suffering, more tragedies and appalling atrocities happening around the world than anybody could ever sort of do anything about, right? It's far more of that sort of human suffering than the greatest saints in history were ever asked to even think about, because they didn't have digital connectivity. And there's also this sort of arms race for attention where it's absolutely incumbent on every media organization, even the really responsible ones, to somewhat exaggerate everything there. Every story has to be written to try to win that arms race of attention. And that means, it certainly means that sort of irresponsible actors make stuff up or talk about phenomena that are really not widespread as if they're terribly widespread. But it even means that, a responsible media organization talking about a genuine crisis will still just go the extra mile, almost without meaning to try to make it survive in that attentional environment. And I think what this all adds up to is that because of these new times in which we live, in terms of attention and the attention economy, it is incumbent on somebody who wants to make a difference to the world outside their own four walls to be willing not only to apply their attention to those other events and crises, but to be willing to withdraw their attention from most of them. So in the olden days, people said, if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention, right? Your job as a good citizen is to be more attentive to what is going on in the rest of the world. I think now it might be a case of saying, no, your job as a good citizen is to pick your battles and be willing to say, and it feels very taboo for anyone who sort of cares about all this stuff, but to say like, right, the reason I am not going to spend my time on things related to climate change, say, is not because I don't think it's real or serious, but because I've just got to pick, and I've picked this other thing, right? I've picked helping fight for safe streets in my city, or I want to contribute some money and some time to alleviating poverty in this particular community, or whatever it might be, right? And maybe there's even a case to be made that none of these things need, like, maybe your life on its own is taking up enough of your time and attention. But the point I'm really getting at is just that, like, it's got to be okay to focus your sort of outer directed compassion in the world that we live in now. And it's actually much more effective than trying to achieve that feeling of staying on top of all the causes of anxiety and suffering and making some contribution to them. That just very quickly becomes a performative, empty gesture.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's maybe on the surface, you would describe it as I'm trying to be a good citizen, an informed voter, et cetera. But if you really look at what you're doing, I think it is, for me, like I got in the car yesterday or the day before to go to work, and it's like, okay, I can listen to the daily, which is the title of the daily is 6 weeks to go to the election,
Hmm.
or I can listen to this book that I really want to read, right? And it's almost like the daily is like a guilty pleasure in some ways, right? Because it's there's something's going to be very salacious, and I'm going to be on top of what the latest this candidate said and that candidate said, and I mean, really, it's entertainment in some ways. The other thing is, I think we just need to be conscious of our mental health. And for me, and you've talked about this, I think in 4,000 Weeks, a similar experience I think you've had. For me, like Twitter has been an addiction
Hmm.
uh, at points, and like even a few, like I've gone through all the steps of like taking it off the phone and doing this, whatever, but
Hmm.
like it's still um, interesting to me. Although I would say even in the last few months, I've noticed that I've noticed myself like almost like tensing up a little bit and even like finding myself getting angry because I'm like, this is crazy. Like this person has millions of followers and they're just churning out this like crazy conspiracy
Hmm.
theory stuff. Like this is clearly not true. And they have millions of followers and they're spinning it. And then I'm like, okay, it's 10 o'clock at night. Why am I looking at this and getting myself like angry in my mind and like I'm not going to do anything about it except I've just trashed my mental health right before I'm going to bed. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's so right. I mean, two things to say about that. One thing is I've noticed just recently that one of the effects, it can't be deliberate, of the sort of changes to how the algorithm works on Twitter is that, and maybe changes to the opinions that are being expressed. I don't know, but the opinions that I'm seeing is that there is a point at which things just become so sort of bleak and repugnant that actually you naturally don't want to be spending large
Right.
chunks of your
Right.
time on it,
Right.
right? It's not like everyone out there is almost seen the light. They just need to be persuaded of my
Yeah,
brilliant
that's
opinions. It's
true.
like,
It's just so
they're just
out
like,
there that
okay,
you're like,
right, yeah, I don't
okay.
want to spend time with those people just as I wouldn't spend time with this people saying that if I
Right.
was in real life, you know. Um, and then the other part of that is just like, yeah, when it comes to politics, especially, and the US election and the sort of crazy making aspects of what's happening in American politics, like it may be your job to be involved in get out the vote. I think it's certainly people's job to vote. And certainly, all sorts of things might be your job. But also part of your job could be like staying sane because the world needs sane people.
Mm.
And that might
Yeah.
involve the understanding that politics is not everything, even when it's at a crisis point, and
Mm.
that actually, and this is more the argument of Robert Tillis, the political scientist. I'm sort of paraphrasing him, but his work has made a big impression on me. You know, actually, one of the things that our broken politics may need is more people doing stuff that is not politics,
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Mm-hmm.
that is civic and involves other people, but is not about prosecuting political arguments, but is actually about um, uh, like keeping hold of a big area of public life and our lives together that is not driven crazy by partisanship.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to get that PSA out of the way. All right, so just kind of coming into the conclusion of our conversation here, I want to just ask you, like we talked a little bit about upfront about it, how you put together this book, how you decided to format it, how you didn't want it to necessarily be, you're not trying to come up with some system that's going to change people's lives necessarily, but you also don't want it to be a book that doesn't have any impact, right? That you read and just put it on the shelf and forget about it. So I'm curious for you, even if it's something like high level, like how are you thinking about it? Are there one or two things in here that you're taking away and are just like very easy, top of mind, you're seeing again and again in your life in terms of how you're actually applying this to your own life?
I mean, it's really the third week of this book about letting life happen and letting action happen, as well as instead of always making it happen. That is definitely my sort of one of my sort of most challenging points. So I'm just finding, we've spoken about it a little bit, but I'm just finding that um, whenever I can remember through journaling, through taking a breather and going on a walk and calling it back to mind. I've got no particular amazing trick for this. Whenever I can remember that actually approaching life as if what I'm doing might be easy, and navigating life at least somewhat with reference to enjoyment and what I would like to do. It's amazing how often this is actually not only a much pleasanter way to live, but actually more effective, right? That I do more of the things that I feel I need to do when I'm willing to sort of navigate my day with reference to what I feel like I'm drawn to from a minute to minute. It's not the case that it's never the case that there's some tax deadline that just has to be met by the end of the day or something. That happens. But it is really remarkable how we talk a lot about trade-offs in this conversation, but there actually isn't or doesn't need to be a trade-off, or the one we think there needs to be, between effective action and enjoyable experience.
I like that. I think you quoted Tim Ferriss in there saying, what if this were easy? I also like the what if this were fun? And one of the things I pride myself on at work is being the guy that is having the most fun or taking the most playful attitude to whatever it is we're doing. Not perfect, but it's something that I think I'm getting better at as I get older. You may have just answered this, but I'm going to ask you anyways, my standard closing question. What's one thing you figured out in life that most others haven't? Very easy, straightforward question.
Wow. I don't know that it's true that most others haven't, because sometimes I think I only come across these insights through having sort of like worse issues than other people. But I would say that it's related to what I just said, that I don't think we need to choose between a sort of peaceful and liberating existence on the one hand and a sort of accomplished and effective and productive one on the other. It isn't like you're either being productive and then you get to relax, or you relax all the time and then you can't be productive. It's like these two things can come together. You can be very sane and calm. I'm not saying I am all the time, but you can find a place of great peace of mind that is actually completely consistent with like doing cool stuff in the world, which I want to do.
Awesome. Well, I think you're doing it, as evidenced by these, the two books of yours that I've read and all of your other work. So speaking of which, everybody go and buy Meditations for Mortals immediately and try it out. We'll see if you can stick to the 28 days, but if you don't, hey, it's okay.
That's fine too. Yeah.
And then you also have a newsletter called The Imperfectionist, appropriately enough. And then social media, where is your preferred place for people to follow you there?
Well, I'm only really at the moment on Twitter at Oliver Burkeman, but given our recent conversation, I'm not sure how much I want people to follow me there. If you want to follow me or support my work, number one, buying the book, and number two, signing up for the email newsletter at my website, oliverburkeman.com. Those are the things.
Cool. Yeah, you won't be disappointed, I promise. Well, Oliver, thank you. This was a real pleasure. I'm so happy we got to do it, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you, and thank you so much for being a guinea pig here, Greg.
Anytime. I will look forward to the next book, and happy to do it as well.
Cheers.
Well, there you go, my friends. Oliver Burkeman. I am psyched that I got to have that conversation. He's a super interesting guy doing some really great work. I'm seeing him actually on a ton of big name podcasts now as well. So I'm feeling very grateful that he was cool enough to do this one. Listen, go get his book, Meditations for Mortals, if this conversation has piqued your interest. I definitely recommend it. And remember, head over to gregcampion.substack.com to subscribe to my bi-weekly newsletter. I'll recap this whole conversation there and share some helpful resources too. So check that out. All right, that's it, my friends. Thank you for listening or watching, and I will see you next time.